It's impressive Shane Smith went from obscurity to all-star, but let's see if he can clear the next career hurdle, winning a Cy Young someday.
You are Locked On White Sox, your daily Chicago White Sox podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, I'm your host, Todd Welter, a lifelong Sox fan. I've been podcasting here for over a year and a half and covered the team well before then. And also I've covered Major League Baseball for outlets such as the Associated Press. And thanks for making Locked On White Sox your first listen every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Well, I'm going to get to the White Sox making a coaching hire that could give a preview of who the next hitting coach will be later after this week's Way Back Wednesday segment. But first, let's discuss the next steps Shane Smith has to take toward being an elite pitcher. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5. And if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Download the app today. All right, so 3 things stand out to me for Shane Smith to take the next step toward being a certified ace. Because he definitely reached dude status with his stuff, being just so impressive. But there's a difference between dude status and ace status. Dude status means your stuff is just filthy. I mean, that's something that you're going to see regularly on Pitching Ninja. But ace stuff, that means your stuff is dominant and that there's barely any holes in your pitching repertoire. And right now, there's still some holes holding Smith back from reaching that next step, because that's where you want to see his career progress. I mean, because right now I would say on a good team, like on a contending team, he's probably, the second, the number 2 pitcher on some teams, maybe definitely a number 3, but he still has ways to go before you're like, that is a top of the line rotation pitcher on 29 other teams. And that's another thing that you would say for an ace. Would he be the top of the rotation pitcher on 29 other teams? And I would say there's, a good amount that, yeah, you could make that case. Definitely like the Rockies, obviously, some fellow peers and bad. But right now, he still has to, tighten some things up. And I think he'd even say he's got to tighten some things up to get to where you're like, that is a certified ace. That's a guy who would be at the front of any rotation on 29 other teams. And I think what he has to clear is he's got to prove that he has the stamina to pitch strong for an entire season. I mean, that's the first thing that he has to do to reach that ace status. He's got to be more confident at throwing his slider or curve just to keep, hitters off balance on his fastball, changeup, and sinker. And also because his curveball, if he throws it just maybe a little bit more, that might be his better wipeout pitch. And then he's got to improve in some of those key advanced stats areas that, the Cy Young winners really are in the red in when you look at Baseball Savant. And the stamina played a huge role, I think, in him going from possibly being one of the early Rookie of the Year contenders, like he was showing, and especially, in April. I mean, he was just outstanding. I mean, that was one of the biggest surprises of the season. Because remember, he's the number 1 pick in the Rule 5 draft. And you're just thinking, okay, maybe can he just, he's got some good velocity on his fastball. No one knew that he actually developed that changeup that really made him this, all-star pitcher. But he had the stuff in the makings where it's like, okay, this guy could probably stay on the roster for the entire season being hidden in long relief. And then he's throwing 99 in spring training. He's looking really impressive. Really, he earned that spot in the rotation. And then that first start against the Twins, first 5 innings. I mean, remember, he's cruising. And then the velocity just dips and, it's just kind of getting that stamina built up. But even then, he was pitching well until mid-June. And then he struggles mightily through the All-Star break. His ERA was over 4 when he was named the team's All-Star representative. And he basically needed that sprained ankle to recharge and, finish strong at the end of the season. And if you need a reminder of him tiring out, here's his monthly totals for those watching on YouTube about how his splits went. I know it's a little bit small, but, he has an ERA under 3 in April, an ERA under 4 in May, and then it gets up in June, even though he had 2 good starts at the beginning, but then he has 2 terrible ones. Then July, he's just totally gassed. His ERA is well over, 5. I mean, you can see it's just massive. But then he goes on the IL after the All-Star break with that sprained ankle. And then look at his August and September production, and he did pitch the most innings in his professional life with 146 and a third innings. So now the next step is, can he be able to log about 20 to 40 or more innings a year? Can he get to that 160, 180 innings? Because getting to 200 innings, that's like now the holy grail for a pitcher. You're seeing most pitchers pitch around now 160, 180. And that's mostly, part of it is the stamina. Can these guys, are these guys getting babied? I don't know if that's the case. I think it's more, again, just front offices understanding more and more the third time through the lineup usually is not the best. So that's why you're seeing a lot of these starters getting pulled a little bit earlier, is just to play the margins a little bit more. But you do want them to at least eat up 6 innings a game, give you some more quality starts, and obviously avoid going on the injured list, and obviously not needing an IL stint to recharge. And then the next step is the pitch selection, which is, being willing to throw that curveball or slider just a bit more to throw off hitters on that deadly fastball and changeup, especially that changeup is getting just such good movement. I love watching him throw his changeup. And I know pitching director Brian Bannister's philosophy is throw your best pitches as much as you can. But you do sometimes need to kind of come up with that third or fourth offering to kind of keep hitters off balance and make sure that lineups are not sitting on his stuff. And there were games where it just seemed like he was just not willing to throw that curve or that slider. If he can just be a little bit more confident that, maybe if his command isn't going right away on the fastball or changeup, which we did see a few times, that maybe his slider or curve can get some strikes and get some outs. And again, especially his curveball might be worth deploying just a little bit more, as that almost seemed to be like his best finishing move, as his curveball per Baseball Savant was actually had the highest whiff percentage of his arsenal at 48.1% and the highest put away percentage at 24.1. So, it's a pitch to maybe just mix in a little bit more. But then he has to clean up in some of those other key statistical areas, that Baseball Savant tracks. And for those watching on YouTube, I kind of have those numbers. If you see it, there's some red there in the great. The fastball run value is really great there. And you're seeing, the some of that other red, the extension, barrel percentage. You didn't allow a lot of hitters to get, barrel up the ball, but he did still get hit a little bit too hard for an all-star pitcher. And that walk percentage needs to come down, because when you look at like these things on the margins that really show, like, are you really dominating a lineup? Take a look at like what Tarik Skubal has and look at how much red there is. I mean, he's got, pretty much, off speed, breaking run value, fastball, that's all in the red. I mean, basically everything, expected ERA in the red, expected batting average, all that stuff, chase percentage, whiff percentage, K percentage, walk percentage, a 4.4 walk percentage. And I know he's sort of a unicorn, and I know he's a lefty, but that's kind of these are what Cy Young pitchers do on the margins. So, like, even if you look at Paul Skenes, and how he matches up. And I know too, like, hey, the eye test, look at the eye test, and you'll see that these guys are dominant. But when you look at the eye test and matching up to what the advanced numbers are saying, I mean, look at this again. I mean, the one thing is Paul Skenes did get a little bit of hard hit. It's in a little shade of blue, but it's still at average. But again, tons of red being great. So it's all about, being able to make sure that you're not getting, hit so hard when contact is made, and making sure too it's not costly contact. And right now Smith has to shore that up, and maybe he kind of should look into what Skenes does to keep up his endurance. But I do think if Smith can get these 3 areas fixed and cleaned up, he has a chance to be an ace on the South Side for years to come. Well, on this date 5 years ago, the White Sox brought back Tony LaRussa as manager, and after winning the 2021 AL Central title, this team has known nothing but losing. So let's discuss on this week's Way Back Wednesday segment how, despite the terrible records, there's actually some signs of progress of leadership-wise, and let's discuss that after the break. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. You and I make decisions every day, but on Prize Picks, being right can get you paid. Don't miss any of the excitement of the sports seasons, whether you're following the NFL, the NBA, or both. There's no better time to jump in on the action. And if you haven't tried it yet, Prize Picks is the simplest way to play. You just pick more or less on at least 2 player stats, and if you get them right, you win. It takes less than 60 seconds to make your lineup, and you can play anywhere Prize Picks operates, including California, Texas, and Georgia. And I love how simple of a concept Prize Picks is. It's pretty much, if I think a player is going to have a great game, I can pick the more option on the player projection. And if I think the player is going to stink, well, I just go with the less option. And the new Stacks features is a game changer. You can now pick more on, say, Steph Curry's points, threes, and assists in the same lineup. Plus, if one of your players leaves early with an injury, the injury reboot saves my lineup from a loss. Download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONMLB for $50 in lineups after your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. It's good to be right. Welcome back to Locked On White Sox. I'm your host, Todd Welter. Again, make sure to hit the like button on today's episode. Subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox. And if you can't catch the show on YouTube, you can get the audio version of the show on places such as Apple or Spotify. So make sure to follow or subscribe at wherever you get your podcasts. Either way, get your 30-minute fix of Chicago White Sox baseball venting with me and maybe some hope. Also, make sure to check out my written content at SouthsideSox.com and on TapSportsNet.com. All right, so Tony LaRussa's rehiring as manager back on this day 5 years ago displayed basically the dysfunction that the team's leadership had. And that would eventually help sink the franchise to the depth of awfulness it currently is in. Now, there is a glimmer of hope that maybe they'll get back to a competitive team at some point, because it seems like, ironically, the dysfunction might be gone. And that's why I want to use this Way Back Wednesday segment to kind of go over how the franchise has actually made some progress in the front office after that dysfunctional dynamic just basically ruined the franchise. Because if you remember, all signs were pointing to A.J. Hinch getting hired by the White Sox. That is who Rick Hahn wanted. Rick Hahn fires Ricky Renteria after basically, being like a deer in headlights after Garrett Crochet exits early in that, game 3 with that injury. Doesn't really manage the bullpen well. White Sox lose to Oakland, do not advance in the playoffs. And, it was kind of time. Ricky, I liked Ricky, but he definitely was not going to be the guy that was going to, take the White Sox to the division title. I mean, you also saw in 2020, remember, in that sprint of the season, they, kind of had a chance to win the AL Central, and it just, they lost some games down the stretch. They did get into the playoffs, obviously, but he wasn't going to get them to where they needed to be. So here it was. Okay, we're going to get A.J. Hinch. Everything is looking sunshine and rainbows. And then it's Jerry Reinsdorf, the team's owner, who basically, kneecaps Hahn and Kenny Williams by wanting to bring back LaRussa to make up for a regret he had when he fired Tony back in the mid-1980s, which, again, I still don't get why Jerry Reinsdorf, and I know this is going to be hot takey, but I still don't get why he had that regret. Because I get that LaRussa went on to a Hall of Fame career, but ask yourself this, and this is what I would love to just even ask Jerry. Would he have had a Hall of Fame career in Chicago? Would he? Had you not fired him? Had you kept him instead of Hawk Harrelson? Now, if that's a regret, yeah, it's a huge regret. You should have never had Hawk Harrelson in the general manager office. You should have had him in the television booth. But does Tony LaRussa, if you just keep going and going, does he have a Hall of Fame career with the White Sox? I doubt it, because the talent deteriorated after 1983. My first conscious memories are those 87, 88, and 89 teams that were not very good because, again, the talent was getting deteriorated. And think about how even the franchise became competitive again in the early 1990s, and especially winning the 1993 AL West Championship. It had to be built up. 4 consecutive first-round picks, all hitting in Jack McDowell, Robin Ventura, Frank Thomas, and Alex Fernandez. And then they actually had to trade Harold Baines to get Wilson Alvarez. And then, those under-the-radar additions that turned out to be really good additions, like, getting Ozzie Guillen's one thing, they did well under Hawk Harrelson's administration, but, adding Tim Raines, adding Lance Johnson. But winning ugly was not sustainable. It was not. And I know there's some, I know I was very, very young. Before then, I would have said it was, but it just wasn't. It was not going to be sustainable. And LaRussa also goes to Oakland, where he had a star-studded lineup. I mean, he had one of the best lineups in all of baseball. It's kind of one of those things where talent did help him win his first World Series. Now, I do think he did truly earn his Hall of Fame credentials when he went to St. Louis. I mean, that's where he won 2 World Series with basically a lineup mostly made up of just solid players. I mean, he had superstars, but it was like 4. I mean, in Oakland, he had the Bash brothers. He just had amazing talent pretty much up and down the lineup. I mean, if you think about it, St. Louis had Albert Pujols, Yadier Molina, Chris Carpenter, and Adam Wainwright. And then they would just always have these guys that would be like, where did this guy come from? You know, like this guy looks like he should be in AAA, and yet he's constantly racking up hits and catching the ball, and that's the type of stuff. And I do think he deserves credit for the winning that was done in St. Louis, because the buttons he typically pushed did add to additional wins that the talent level, I would say, had no business winning outside of those 4 elite players. I mean, he did a good job of instilling a culture of pitching and catching the ball, moving on the bases, and he could put together some good lineups to maximize the offense. But that era of playing baseball the Cardinal way was fading by 2021, and you saw what happened. And especially in 2021, the buttons Tony usually pressed actually turned to losses. I mean, that 2021 team won the division in spite of Tony, not because of him. And when they needed him to press the right buttons in the ALDS against Houston, he figuratively got pantsed by Dusty Baker. And then came the decline into mediocrity and dysfunction. But just again, ask yourself, if Jerry Reinsdorf never fires Tony LaRussa, does he go on to a Hall of Fame career? I don't think so. I think he has a decent career. Maybe they turn things around, but I think eventually it was going to be coming that they were going to have to part ways. So that's why, again, it frustrates me to this day that he has this regret. But also, I mean, think about the dysfunction and mediocrity that this franchise then sunk into, in part because of LaRussa's leadership. I mean, the players could not coexist with each other in 2022. And you never knew who was in charge of the White Sox. And that was a big reason that the team declined into the state we are in now. Now, however, it sounds like the front office has come a long way after, there was this potential of Tony still being the shadow GM at the start of Chris Getz's tenure. Because, he's still involved as an advisor, but you no longer hear Tony's name being mentioned in any decisions, and the front office supposedly functions well on collaboration from everything that, others have heard that have relayed on other podcasts and that type of stuff. And kind of what I saw when I was down at Podcast Row, I mean, it sounds like there's a very collaborative effort within the front office, and it's being modernized. So you get the idea, for better or worse, at least Getz is making the final call. You know that he's in charge. And if things go right, like the Garrett Crochet trade, you give Getz his flowers. When things go wrong, you know who to point the finger at. But even then, with the dysfunction, when LaRussa was the manager, you didn't know who was running things. Was it Jerry? Was it Kenny? Was it Tony? Was it Rick? And even the crochet trade represents that Getz is fully in charge, and that look at the return that they got. That was a huge return for the rebuild. It wasn't an immediate gratification return or an immediate, hey, let's try to turn things around like, they tried to do with the Dylan Cease return, because that was more fitting to Jerry's mandate of, hey, we got to turn things around quickly. You saw a return of, high floor players, but nothing that would really turn things around, as Jerry was hoping. Drew Thorpe's changeup had ace potential, but the rest of his stuff might just make him a reliever. And it was nothing that was going to be a foundational trade, like when Getz finally was allowed to call it a rebuild and then really leverage Crochet's trade asset status. Now, Getz is still shackled by Jerry's limited payrolls, but it sounds like he's building a harmonious front office with a vision of making sure you acquire players with more well-rounded skill sets, although it'd be nice if some of them could play better defense. But the decisions seem to be more collaborative in a good way, and everyone is pulling in the same direction. Something that did not happen 5 years ago and ended up sinking the franchise long-term. Well, the White Sox did make a coaching hire to their development staff, but it might be another clue into the direction the team is going with in filling their the hitting coach position. So let's discuss that after the break. The NBA is back, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you missed the start of the game or you want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. And it keeps every game exciting, especially when your team's making that late push. And I'm always telling you about how fun it is to play FanDuel's traditional money lines, the over-unders, and the spreads. But if you want to win some big-time money, or at least double or triple your cash, play FanDuel's props, parlays, or futures. So, for example, you think Luka is going to win the MVP this year. He's at plus 500 the last time I checked. So even throwing, say, something as small as like $10 on that gives you a chance to turn that into $50 if he does win the MVP. Milwaukee is putting a lot on Giannis's plate, so maybe he takes home the MVP. The last time I checked, it was at plus 1,300. So $10 on that possibly happening will pay out $130. And right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Welcome back to Locked On White Sox. I'm your host, Todd Welter. Again, shout out to all the everydayers. I appreciate your loyalty. Please hit the like button on today's episode. Recommend to your fellow Sox fans or baseball fans, friends, and subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox, or wherever they get their podcasts, as this show is available on all major podcast platforms. So the team is hiring Sherman Johnson to be its minor league hitting coordinator. And, not exactly earth-shattering news, but I do believe it can be a clue into the direction of where the team might be going with their hitting coach hiring. Johnson is coming over from the Orioles organization after he was in their organization from 2023 to this year. He's not being retained with the new manager hire that's happened in Baltimore. And he pretty much overlapped with White Sox hitting director Ryan Fuller. So to me, this move strengthens the team wanting to implement the hitting development philosophy the Orioles use to produce so many young, talented bats. I think they kind of want to replicate what did the Orioles do. And I mean, obviously drafting well, getting those bats into your system, but you still got to develop them. And I think that's kind of what they want to follow. And that means, I'm just reading the tea leaves here, kind of just speculating, but it could be an indication that the team could be inclined to tap into Fuller's ties by hiring another connection that he might have to be the big league hitting coach. Because remember, Marcus Thames had to go. I mean, he had to. The offense was terrible in the first half, and it didn't start to improve until Colson Montgomery, Kyle Teel, and Edgar Carroll got called up. And those guys pretty much hit the ground running. So you can't say Tim's had a hand in that, like hand in hand in getting them going. I mean, they impressed. I mean, again, Montgomery, 21 homers in 71 games. Teel, Carroll, at least doing really good on the bat-to-ball skills. They obviously now have to hit for some more power, but definitely were very impressive at the plate. And phase two then means you can't have regression with those three. You can't have stagnation. It's all about improvement. And I just don't see that happening under Marcus Thames. And I mean, I would definitely be willing to, tap into what Ryan Fuller, who he might know in his network, because again, Colson hitting 21 home runs in 71 games and basically improving at the plate at AAA after his Arizona reset with Fuller. Because you got to remember, they pulled him from game action at AAA, sent him to the Glendale, Arizona spring training facility to work with Fuller on his swing for a couple of weeks. And it worked. Now you just got to hope it sustains. And that's, again, getting a hitting coach that can help make sure whatever Fuller's preaching to all the hitters is implemented at the big league level. Because I'm all for bringing in people he's worked with. Because when you hire someone like Ryan Fuller to be your director of hitting, you're basically saying, we want to be hitting, have the same hitting philosophy, have the same hitting fundamentals. I mean, obviously you tweak it to each different player because not every player is the same, but you just want to have that general philosophy from complex league to the big leagues. And I know this is Will Venable's staff, but again, if you want to have that goal of this is how we're going to be preaching hitting at the complex league all the way up to when they get to the big leagues, you want to make sure the big league coaching staff can work well with the directors, and the same goes with the manager. You want to make sure Venable is in lockstep with Brian Bannister, your pitching director, and Ryan Fuller, your hitting director. And that's why when I look at SoxOn35th.com, Jordan Lazowski's list, I keep coming back to Joel McKeith and getting the promotion. He was the team's assistant hitting coach. And you got to remember, he was one of the few hires Venable got to make last year. And it wouldn't surprise me if he developed a good relationship with Fuller. And I wonder how much Fuller had on the process. But if these are both, if they both signed off on it, it would just make sense to promote him. Because again, he came from outside the organization. He really wasn't, under Marcus Timms that long, or had that, he's only been with the White Sox for a year. So it wouldn't shock me if that's where they go. It also wouldn't surprise me if the relationship was good with Fuller and Matt Schulte when they were co-hitting coaches in Baltimore, that he gets hired if Minnesota decides to let him out of his contract. So, that wouldn't shock me either. Now, I'm not ruling out, like, say, a Donnie Ecker, either, considering he did interview for the White Sox manager job last, offseason with Chris Getz, and maybe he left an impression on Getz and he has ties to Venable. But what it means is this hire has to be a collaborative decision with Getz, Venable, and Fuller. And to me, if all three are aligned, I think it just makes sense to bring in someone who can work seamlessly with Fuller. Because again, what I always look for in a hitting coach is, especially with this structure, obviously you want Will Venable to kind of be able to say, okay, for example, like I love when Venable said, hey, we're having trouble hitting fastballs. We got to be able to hit velocity much better. That's kind of the things that you want to see Will Venable be able to do. Look at what's going wrong with the team and say, we got to fix this. But then that is, again, where the hitting coach comes in. And like Ryan Fuller, how do we make those adjustments? How do we implement those adjustments? The other adjustment the other big thing that I think a hitting coach is major responsibility is making sure those hitters are prepared for the game that they're playing that day to face that pitcher. It's looking, kind of helping, making sure, working with the front office and Venable to make sure, do we have an attack in place for that game? Do we have to get aggressive early? Or can we have the good swing decisions like Ryan Fuller is preaching, that type of stuff? Because sometimes you do have to jump on a pitcher. It does happen. Sometimes, pitchers are going to be given their strikes or their mistakes early in the count. But that just being well scouted and well prepared. And I think that's a big thing that the hitting coach can do. And then, obviously, if Ryan Fuller can't provide a solution, that's where I want the backup for a hitting coach to be able to provide, hey, I got this idea. Let's work on this thing. And then, obviously, just making sure that, these hitters are studying the film, studying the tape, depending on, what are their capacity for being able to, be able to process and be up at the plate. Because you sometimes don't want some guys, and I'm not saying they're stupid. It's just some guys want to keep things very, very simple, and that's fine. Like, again, Luis Robert Jr., things have to be simple for him. So, again, you can make sure he's prepared in a simple way. But Kyle Teal, it sounds like, loves all this, advanced data. So making sure, so it is. Can you tailor the preparation to each guy? But then can you also, if there's a solution that needs to be made, can you help provide that solution if Ryan Fuller's solution doesn't work? So that's kind of what I'm looking at. And to me, when you got that sort of that collaboration working, it just makes sense to maybe default to, hey, let's go with somebody that Ryan Fuller can work with. And that, if Will Venable sees that there's an issue, he can communicate to that issue. And again, Will Venable holding his coaching staff accountable to making sure they're holding the players accountable. And as I said in the second segment, let's just avoid the dysfunction, as we've seen how that has rotted the franchise. Well, that wraps up this edition of Locked On White Sox. Thank you for making Locked On White Sox your first listen every day. For your second listen, check out Locked On MLB Game Night. Every game, every night until a World Series champion is crowned. Get local analysis on a national scale. Find MLB Game Night on Locked On MLB on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. I'll be back tomorrow to go over who on the roster should be on thin ice. You can leave comments about today's episode on the YouTube page via email, lockedonwhitesox@gmail.com, or on X, formerly Twitter, @LockedOnSox or @ToddJDub. Also, make sure to like today's episode on YouTube or leave a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. Also, subscribe to the YouTube channel @LockedOnWhiteSox or wherever you get your audio-only podcasts. Have a great day, and I will see you tomorrow.